Good morning and welcome to this workshop. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. David HYERLE, well known as the developer of the Thinking Maps model. Dr. HYERLE is, as you know, a noted author, presenter, keynote speaker, and expert on thinking schools, whole school change, and visual tools. David is founder and presently co-director of Thinking Schools International. This is a consulting group that works around the world to share an integrated approach to educational transformation in places such as Ethiopia, Norway, India, Brazil, Lithuania, the United Kingdom, South Africa, Thailand, and Malaysia. In the United States, David is co-director of the Designs for Thinking consulting group and founder of Thinking Foundation, a non-profit organization focused on research on thinking, leading, and learning. Today, he will be sharing his expert opinion of the journey of thinking schools, the theoretical foundations, principles, models, and research on thinking schools from around the world. Dr. HYERLE?
Oh, okay. Thanks. Buenos dias. There's so much thinking going on here, isn't there? How's your mind doing? It's okay? There's great research on, you probably know it, on cognitive load. It's called cognitive load theory. So I would suggest we just go outside and enjoy the sun. Oh, okay. So thank you for being here. And this is going to be an interactive time for us, and it's mostly for you. I'm going to bring in some ideas through the hour, but I'm going to engage you in a conversation that my colleagues and I had about 7 or 8 years ago when we had looked over the work that we had all done over 20-something years in different countries with different programs and models and theories, trying to work with whole school change and trying to bring this all together so it could be both coherent and flexible. And so we had this conversation about 7 years ago, and as we were conceptualizing it, we said, well, let's give it a name. And so we named it Thinking Schools. Pretty obvious, but not so obvious, because it's so complex. I mean, this conference is a nice expression of the complexity and range and depth and just creative possibilities that are happening here in this country and around the world. So what I'd like to do is take you a bit through our journey, but I'd also like to engage you from the beginning with having you think about that term, thinking schools. So here's what I would like you to do. This won't hurt. This won't, okay? Okay. So what I'd like you to do is, this is very simple, this shouldn't be painful, is make concentric circles on a page. How hard is that? And in the center, now it's okay, now it's going to get a little more difficult. In the center, just write the words thinking school. And this is a very simple visual tool. It's called a circle map, and it's for defining in context. So today what we're going to do together for a while is try to define a thinking school and give context to it. But every person sitting here has a different context and some different ideas. Just as in every classroom, every child comes from a different place in a different context. So what I'd like you to do is somewhat quietly take a few minutes or a minute and a half or so and jot down any ideas that come to mind about these two words, thinking school. What does that mean? And jot your ideas down in this outside circle, okay? Just take a moment. And if you're drawing a blank, literally drawing a blank, that's okay. Just take another moment. And now, if you will, just take a moment and have a conversation. Share your map with somebody right next to you. Just take a moment, okay? Okay. Pretty soon you'll hear my voice. Pretty soon. And we'll come back together. Thank you. Okay. Okay, I'm done. Okay, let's come back together. Sometimes it's hard to start thinking and it's even more difficult to stop. So with the time constraints, we'll move it along relatively quickly. One thing is that right now, if I collected all of these, brought them to the front, I could very quickly scan, or as a teacher, I can walk around and see the context that you've developed around a thinking school. And if we started using other visual tools together, and we're going to get into that a little bit later, I would have an in-the-moment formative assessment of where you are, not necessarily from my point of view, but from the collective consciousness of this group. So one of the things we do often and have done over the years is thought about how teachers speak and engage and mediate students' thinking. Visual tools, I think, are very powerful when they're dynamic, not graphic organizers that you fill in, but dynamic for sharing information. If we had time right now, I would have you then get into groups of 4, consolidate your map, and then I'd have you come together and present them to the whole group. And what, as a teacher, I am doing is giving you a tool for a certain kind of thinking, but also engaging the content directly. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do throughout this hour, is add to your map. So at the end, it's going to be an evolution of ideas. So Let me just start with a couple of examples, because I think I actually went back to the description that I had written for this workshop and said, oh yeah, what did I say I was going to do? And it's really about putting this, the work that we've been doing in the context of the countries that we've been working in. And while it sounds grand to say we're working in this country and that country, every country is different, and we've had some successes and we've had some outright flops. Very difficult, because what we're doing, and everybody here recognizes, is that we're asking and we're supporting schools in making a significant shift toward a new kind of pedagogy that I think fits the students of our age and our times. So it's difficult, and it's different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds from university through to early years. So let me just say that we've been working in places like Malaysia and Ethiopia. And let me start with Ethiopia to give a bit of a framework here. So Ethiopia is a country that had never been colonized. It's never been colonized. It's about 105 million people right now. Addis Ababa, the capital, has about, I think, 8 or 9 million people in it. And we've been working in a grassroots effort over time to a really nice point right now where they're in the north of Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, 36 pilot schools that are systematically moving forward in bringing thinking schools approach into these schools. And we've done training of trainers, so there's expertise developed there. Ethiopians are doing the training, so we've collaborated with them in order that they have the expertise to work within their own schools. And then we're beginning to work at the university level, and I'm going to get to this at the end of our time together, on accreditation, where the schools and the universities are working together to do really high quality action research that then gets shared as part of their own internal processes, but also gets shared across Ethiopia and hopefully around the world. Now, the issue in Ethiopia, like Malaysia, which I want to just speak about in a minute, is that they realize that if they don't change now, their country is in big trouble. The global economy, the dynamism of labor markets. I mean, there are a lot of concern about how the Ethiopian students are going to be able to really engage in a global environment if they're being lectured to. The same thing we found in Malaysia. We were invited by the Prime Minister's Office of Innovation in Malaysia. Anybody from Malaysia here today? And the focus was really to develop 10 pilot schools strategically located around the country in order that deeper expertise could be developed in those pilots, and then training of trainers outward from there. I asked the director of this Office of Innovation, why would you want to implement or bring about this kind of change? Why something called thinking schools? And he was immediately targeted. He said, what we have, our students come out of secondary school, and he used this term, docile. Docile. So when they go to university, to college or university, or they go into the workplace, they're saying to either their employers or their university professors, what do I do? Tell me what to do. How do I do it? And that, in fact, what he said was that Malaysia will become basically a labor source for the rest of the world. So there's a very interesting dynamic as we're talking about looking closely at individual teachers, classrooms, whole schools, that countries now are really recognizing that there's a moral imperative, not just about developing better teaching and better, higher quality thinking, but it's actually around to a certain degree, maybe an exaggeration, survival of the country within the global workplace. So this is some of the context that we're working in. How is it that we can work in different places and really have a model that is sustainable and scalable? And this, I think, is a really big issue because we can go school by school, but there are a lot of places that want to say, how do we get some coherence in really moving this forward, and also high degrees of flexibility? And those seem contradictory, right? How do you have something that's coherent and somewhat stable and highly flexible? If you would, take a moment, go back to your map and your conversation. I've just talked about 2 places. Think about your country in the context of your school, your colleagues. What are the implications for something called thinking schools? Just take another moment and I'll bring you back. What does it mean for your school?
We got the question right. Okay, so the question was, what implications would it have for our school
To become a thinking school.
such a development? What do we propose here?
Yeah. Soon you'll hear my voice. Never good at classroom management. Okay, there we go. So, here we go. Isn't this the way you want classrooms to sound? This is the way we want classrooms to sound. You can fault me for my classroom management. But one of the things, we all know intuitively, and we know as professionals, if you have students engaged in their thinking, they're going to be like what you're doing right now. And that, to me, is, obvious benefit. So, the idea here is that, well, let's take Ethiopia and Malaysia. They saw and see a playing field or a pitch, depending on how you call it, and a football game or match, or soccer as we call it in the United States. I follow football quite a bit, so I call it football. That whether it's in a country looking globally, or a school and a classroom and a group of kids, there is often a playing field that is uneven. And there's a nice metaphor, I don't know if you use the metaphor here. In the United States, the phrase is, we need to level the playing field. We need to make it level for all kids. But what happens is when we teach content, and I was a teacher for a few years in Oakland, California, with 95% of my students were African American youth. And when I came in and started teaching with these students, 85% of them were in the lower quartiles in literacy and mathematics. And what we did, and what I did as a young teacher, is if they didn't get the content, I did what was called remediation, which meant I gave them the content again. And if they didn't get it, what did I do? I gave it to them again. And then again, and then they went on to the next year. And at that point of my teaching career, a gentleman you know quite well right now, Art Costa, who kicked off the keynote yesterday, came into my classroom. And I mentioned this in my workshop yesterday, totally changed my view of what it was to be a teacher, and that it was about mediating the students' thinking. And Art had a view that we drew on. Well, let me just go here, and it's this. And I believe that this very simple view is really clear about trying to get a definition of what is thinking. What is this about? And maybe you've seen this before, but he basically identified three general areas. We can teach for thinking, meaning that there are all these techniques and strategies that we as teachers can use, okay, to improve. We can use wait time. We can have think, pair, share, like I just did with you. We can have cooperative groups. We can ask higher order questions. How many of you know Bloom's taxonomy? Okay, Bloom's taxonomy. When I was a young teacher, they said, well, in my teacher training, they said, by the way, what we want you to do is ask questions at the higher ends of Bloom's taxonomy. What do you think my students did? Like this, right? It's like, just a minute, how do I answer that question? So we can do a lot teaching for thinking. A second area is teaching of thinking. And this is where yesterday I talked about and we engaged with student-centered models, and I'm going to get to that, which is a foundation of our approach. But it's directly and explicitly teaching students the models of thinking that we have in our heads. So one of the things that really turned me around is I went into a classroom in New York City where I do a lot of work, and the teacher was teaching the students Bloom's taxonomy. That is different than us using Bloom's taxonomy as an adult language for us to develop a cognitive base for instruction. So we're going to talk a little bit about that later, but then also the teaching about thinking. So the different kinds of thinking, how now with neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, linguistic neuroscience, what we know about learning, actually engaging students in understanding what we're all learning right here in this, these 5 days and your careers. I was in a school in England that had implemented over time the Thinking Schools approach. I went there for a day because they had a thinking conference, but it was run all by the students. The students were giving workshops to other students from other schools in Bloom's taxonomy, habits of mind, thinking maps, the brain and neuroscience, and philosophy for children. And the students were rotating, and these were all being facilitated by students who had become so fluent with these models that they could teach their peers how to do it. That's that level of teaching, really combining teaching for thinking, because it engages the teacher, teaching of thinking, so they're models and strategies, and then teaching about thinking, where students are really engaged now in understanding more about how the brain works and the mind and that connection. So take a moment and, oh, well, you know what? I'm going to go back and just do something very pragmatic and give you a view of the definition we came up for thinking schools. So I need your critique. Thinking Schools International is an expanding group of educators. This is what our vision is. From around the world, focused on developing, implementing, documenting, and openly sharing the practices of, and this is a key term, explicitly improving all students, teachers, and administrators' thinking abilities. Take a moment with your pair. Think about for, of, and about thinking a little bit. Maybe you can drop that into your map, and then take a look at this vision of what we have as our role, and then I'm going to get into the sort of the meat of it. So take another moment. What have you gotten from these last few minutes? Okay, here we go. So one of the things that we grappled with, we were a group, Liz, 7 or 8 years ago, that said, okay, we're going to do training in habits of mind, which we did a lot of. Oh, we're doing a lot of training in thinking maps. It's a visual language that I developed about 20 years ago or more. Yes, I'm that old. That's amazing. And philosophy for children. We did training in De Bono's thinking hats. We had all these different approaches. Philosophy for children. We were using creativity work, Tony Ryan's thinker keys, and I was going, wow, this is like way too much for me to handle. What about the kids? It's like they have all this content to learn, and now we're giving them 14 different ways. You know, it was just like, this is overwhelming. We got to get a hold of this somehow, because are we just doing what we do with content, which is just spilling a lot of stuff onto kids and hoping they absorb some of it? So we came up first off with these 3 principles, and I'm going to start moving a little more quickly through the slides. But we came up with these 3 principles. I went over this yesterday a little bit. And you have access to this presentation by video, I believe, and PDF. But that first off, we believe that, and I think it resonates across this conference, that all learners have the innate abilities to think in a variety of ways. That there's an innateness about it. So you know that uneven playing field? The breaking the myth is saying, hey, we start with all children being able to think. That we're born to think. That's who we are, as Art started off talking about. Second is that, and I'm going to get into this, that student-centered models are really important, and that the students become fluent with those models. They aren't just me as a teacher using really good strategies to facilitate your thinking. It's about directly and explicitly giving the students the models, they become fluent, and they are able to use these models together. That was a sort of a key insight for us and a principle. And then 3, that it has to be connected explicitly to content learning. It can't be some sort of bolt-on or add-on, or I remember when I was in 1st, 2nd grade, there was always brain teasers at the end of the day. Did you have those? You know, the teachers would give me a brain, I mean, my brain was fried at 2:30, and just to keep us there for another half an hour, you'd have a brain teaser. It's like, what's that about? You know, so it isn't about giving some strategies or models. These models, the filter for saying that this is a high quality model is that students can immediately apply it to content learning, concept development, and if you will, higher order thinking. So these 3 principles guide us. The question is, one of the questions that we really looked at, what is this variety of ways of thinking? So we came up with this, and actually I was very fortunate to be at Harvard University with David Perkins for a few years back in the 80s, and I was working there finishing my research, and he really has written a lot about these different types of thinking. Art Costa, there are a lot of people around the world that have looked at this, but we've basically wanted to get a summary view, so when we're working in a school, the teachers realize we're not just doing one, there's a wide range of possibilities. There isn't just these singular models. So learning modalities, some people call those learning styles, creativity, cognitive processes, inquiry methods, some people spell that with an I, not an E, and dispositions. Take a moment real quick. Is there anything, just talk to your partner, is there anything that you think is missing? Because I'm sure there is. But just take a moment. Is there anything that you would add to that or embellish? Just take a moment. Does that make sense? And you can jot these down if you want. What else would you add, even from the last few days? All right. Is this pretty good? Who would add, would you add anything? Okay, so this is like an umbrella, and it's an attempt to say there's a whole range of things. I mean, you've been to workshops, you've been to keynotes, you've been to a lot of there are a whole lot of ways of going. And I think it's really important as we're working with colleagues, teachers, folks that are into teacher training at universities, that it isn't that we just start coming in, oh, we should do this or this, let's get a broad view. So does anybody want to have an addition to this or a subtraction? Anybody want to take something away from? Yeah.
Where would you put metacognition?
Metacognition? Well, I would, in Art's model, Habits of Mind, he would put it in as a disposition. But I would say that they're metacognition is active across. For one, and let me come back to that when I get to the thinking points model. Because I'm very intrigued by the idea is how can you have Okay, let me play with this for a second. This is intriguing for me because I've always been interested in the idea when you say, well, tell me about how you're thinking. You know, when you ask that question, not just what you're thinking, but tell me how you're thinking. And then a student or a colleague just sort of tells you everything that they're thinking about. Well, I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking. To me, that isn't metacognition. That's telling me what's going on in my brain or mind. The question, and Art really does this very well, where he'll say, it isn't the what, it's the how. So when you step aside and you say, how are you thinking about it? Are you thinking about that idea from, let's say, a cause and effect point of view? Or are you thinking about it philosophically? Are you thinking about it in the sense of empathy? So you're stepping back away from the what of your thinking and you're saying, how am I thinking about it? And I think that we're a bit sloppy with this term metacognition because we're just saying, well, tell me what you're thinking about. And that's all of a sudden metacognition. I mean, there are a lot of gray areas, correct? But I would rather have students have that explicit vocabulary developed and an understanding. It's really how they're thinking, not just repeating what they're thinking, okay? But I think they go across that. Any other additions? Yeah.
I was interested in how these are actually related to each other,
Thank you, because I'm going right there. I mean, that's exactly the problem, because then you have all these programs, right? That, okay, now we have a philosophy program, philosophy for learning. And that really would come under sort of inquiry. And then you have a cognitive process model. And then you have a creativity model. And all of a sudden it's like, okay. So that was our biggest concern, is the integration rather than the separation. So, just a minute. That's way too much information, okay? But here was our shot at this, of bringing that together, is that, let me see if, so, here is, and again, take a picture of it. You're going to be able to get this on a PDF. Just a minute. This is like, anybody have the selfie stick? If I've been traveling around, and I understand that now Disneyland has outlawed selfie sticks. I don't know, maybe, some kid was whacking some other, I don't know. I was in Barcelona, it was spectacular. I was in Paris and London doing a trip, and everybody's walking around like this. And I don't know if that's like metacognition or just ego. I don't know. This is like, what's going on here? And then all these people are selling you selfie sticks, or they'll sell you a Heineken, a good beer. So, let me walk you through this very quickly, because I don't want to, this is too much on the page. But the idea here is, here are these dimensions, and then we were struggling with the question you just asked. So we really worked on what are the basic, what we think are the most important pathways, if you were to focus. And this is from our work with schools over 10 or 15 years. And we came up with the area of cognition, and we use a visual tools model. So fundamental Piagetian mental operations. How does the brain, and now we know that the brain actually categorizes and sequences and compares and does causality unconsciously. But we also consciously have these cognitive processes. So we believed that that was very important. But we also know that these are done creatively through different modalities. So creativity and modalities, you see those sort of dotted lines? We believe that those interact with all of these, and we make a point of bringing that forward. The second area, and there's no sequence here, a second area is developing inquiry skills in students, and questioning, self-questioning, philosophical questioning, a whole integration of how do you ask and develop your questioning abilities, and there's some presentations here on problem-based learning. How do you really engage that level of understanding? and philosophical questioning as well. So we use a model for that. And then we thought a third area that we found was key was dispositions for mindfulness. That dispositions or habits of mind, the inquiry processes, and the cognitive processes using visual tools integrate together. How easy is that to do? Not easy. Not easy. So, here's where we were with this. We believe that what would be really key, and this is why we're into longer term implementation and the whole idea of how do you have some coherence so you can scale this within your school or to multiple schools, is that these would become, we would suggest to a school that they start in one of these three places depending on their context. Now they may also have already brought in, let's say, De Bono's 6 hats. They may have all, you may have already used philosophy for children. But we're suggesting that a school begin with one of these and teach them directly to students in the first year. In the second year, take on a second model and have the students become fluent with that. And then in the third year, take on a third model. So you're slowly building the expertise. So what we don't do is work with the school and say, okay, we're going to teach you these 3 great models for thinking, and we want you to use them right away, and we want you to go and work with the students. What we do is suggest a multi-year implementation. Okay? Take a moment with this visual in mind and think about, if you will, the integration of these, which is I'm taking off from your question. What does it look like for integrating these models for thinking? What would it look like in your school over 3 to 4 years? Let me ask that question again and with more clarity. What would it look like in a school that you work in or a school that you know where over 3 to 4 years one of these models was brought in with each year? What would it look like at the end of 4 years? Okay? Just take a moment and talk about that, the integration of these models. And is it possible? Right here. Okay, here we go. I'm going to give you a little more information. 1, 2, 3. Here we go. So I'm going to give you a little more information, and then I want you to jump back into your conversation. So here is the thinking points model, and then I want you to just jump in back into your conversation because these ultimately integrate together. So here are fundamental cognitive processes. So it's viewpoints for identifying context, just like we did with the circle map. Characteristics or attributes, properties. So students are able to cluster those qualities together and make comparisons. Part points is spatial reasoning, part whole spatial analysis, anatomy, right? Human body. Parts of a computer, parts of a car, parts of the universe. Change points, which is basically sequencing or cause and effect reasoning or feedback loops. for systems thinking. I'll make a little side comment. My biggest critique, and there are a couple of workshops that have been presented on systems thinking. I think that for me, if we're actually going to go deep into developing students' thinking, we have to look at systems thinking because it's non-linear. And we teach for systems, don't we? We teach for body systems, social systems, political systems. That's what we're trying to teach, but in fact, most of it is taught in a linear way, right? So is the brain linear? It's holistic. Are our lives linear? Only for the demented, you know. That was not fair. No, I mean, if you thought of your life only as linear, you'd be in trouble. Because it's dynamic. You're engaging in so many, your brain is in so many different ways. So the idea is if we don't get to systems thinking somehow, I think our problems are systemic. Think about global problems, global warming, water issues around water shortages and privatization of water. All of these issues have to do the economics within a country. Look at what Greece is going through, that it has ripple effects across the whole world. So we're teaching students in linear formats, and if we don't get to systems thinking, I think that we're really stepping back from giving kids an understanding of how, at least this is my perspective, how the world works, which is holistically and systemically, okay? That was my only preaching. I won't preach anymore. And then group points for categorization. So these are cognitive processes. They come right out of Piaget. This is nothing new. They're mental operations, they're in the cognitive science research, they're in the neuroscience research. And they're made dynamic and useful for kids as a visual tool. So they're activating these kinds of thinking in nonlinear ways. Okay? So that's one of the models. Oh, by the way, here's an integrated view of an apple. This is a complex view using all the viewpoints. Okay? You have 3 seconds to take this picture. 3, 2. So here's the second model. These are student-centered models. That means we're teaching them directly to kids. This derives directly from habits of mind. But we ran into this problem in Malaysia because they were saying, oh great, habits of mind, 16, where do we start? Which do you think are the most important for kids to understand? And so we present these, and people can change this. There's nothing perfect or magical about it. But the idea of developing in the classroom reflectiveness, connectivity, which is empathy, flexibility, precision, and persistence. Okay? That's a fundamental model. It's basic. The students aren't learning right off the bat all 16 habits of mind, but they can over time. And then the questioning for inquiry process, which really in a lot of ways comes out of the scientific method. So you're reacting to a problem, you're researching it, you're designing a solution, you're rethinking that solution or assessing it, and then you're revising your solution, and then you can start again. So, I know that's really quick, and I apologize for sort of running through these, but take a moment now, go back to your conversation. If students, let's say, learn this model in the first year, and they learn this model in the second year, and they learn this model in the third year, or the other way around, it doesn't matter. You could learn this model in the first year, dispositions in the second year. 3, 2, 1.
The pressure.
And the pressure is, I know, and then this in the third year. So what would happen over 3 years? How would the school look if the students were fluent with these? Take a moment. Different from your schools now? What would it look like? Okay. Here we go. So, can I just say, so I'd like to say it's simpler than it looks. I mean, in fact, if you take it a step at a time, it's not so overwhelming. And I'm talking about the students. I was just talking, these ladies from Australia who went through the Thinking Schools accreditation process with Exeter University, which I'll talk about just for a minute, and then our time will run out. And they were, I'd been doing a lot of work in New Zealand, some in Australia, and there was a head teacher, assistant head teacher, Jill Hubble, in the late 1998 or 9, and their school, it was an all-girls school in Auckland, New Zealand, said, we're going to take on thinking. And this is the approach. And everybody said yes. So teachers went out, found all different models. Teachers were engaging students, and there just seemed to be such great activity. And then they sent a questionnaire around to students saying, hey, how's it going? It was just so overwhelming. You go into one classroom, teachers were, oh, it's all creativity, and and then over here it's like it's all cognition, and then over here it's all philosophical questioning, and it was just like, and so she consolidated with her drive team and said, let's really focus on habits of mind. I had worked with them on thinking maps. They really focused on thinking maps. And then they focused, I believe it was also on philosophy for children. And they threw in a little de bono just to mix it up a little bit. And they systematically taught their kids, their students, these, basically early years through graduation, systematically taught them the models over time. And there was coherence. But within that, there was tremendous flexibility. So the teachers they all had their own teaching styles, but the students had common language for activating their thinking processes or cognitive processes, a common language for dispositions, and a common language for inquiry or philosophy for children. So it's doable if a school is willing to say, we'll take it a step at a time and not rush into it, which is really, really hard to do sometimes, because we as educators, we want the best for our students, but we can overload them with too much and too many variations and so much chaos. I think of a school in the sense of a student going through it, not the teachers in it. And I think oftentimes we think about, I care deeply about teaching and teachers and my colleagues, but I'm thinking, what is the goal? It's the student going through, and are they getting a coherent language that is highly flexible from which they can become independent and interdependent learners? And too often I think we focus on doing a lot of professional development training with our colleagues, and it doesn't translate to the kids. They get sort of overwhelmed. And there's a lot of good things that come out of it. So where we are now, and I'm going to just take a few minutes to close out, one of the things that, and this may feel a little promotional to you, and it doesn't mean to be, but I am excited about this. We just produced what is called a live book, which is it's also called a Lumi book, like luminosity. And this is our primary guide when we're working in a blended model of face-to-face training along with follow-up. And what it is it's on the web, but it has video, it has downloads, but it also has social media, and you can create learning communities within the book. You can critique the author. The author can make changes because he stumbled so badly. I can go into this book and change it, and as we work in different countries, we're going to add video from that country. It's going to be translated into Spanish next year. And so what we're doing is this becomes this dynamic resource. It's not really a book. It's something that you use over time. It includes the things that, the models, an overview of the models. We're going to create Lumi books for students so they become the centers of their own learning and reflection around these different models. So it's back to that idea at the beginning. It isn't just what's the theory of thinking schools or what are the models that are used. It's also how do you really create a rich implementation process, and how do you do high quality professional development training and training of trainers so that it isn't just an isolated school, but we're networking schools from all over the globe. So what's exciting about this, anybody that gets into the Lumi book will be able to talk to anybody else around the world through the Lumi book about what's going on in their schools. And I think we were just talking about this. How do we take this conference and all that's going on here and elevate it to a global conversation? That's too idealistic maybe for this moment, but that's the thing, is how do we work together? I'm going to just close, because I know we're getting there, to the whole area of assessment. Because I don't know, I haven't seen too many presentations of this conference on assessment. How do you know where you are? How does the school know where they are? Are they being quote unquote successful, and by whose measure? And by what measures? So this is just an overview. We've done accreditation of thinking schools, and these are highly qualitative, collaborative assessments through Exeter University. And there's criteria set up, and schools submit portfolios, but they set the standard for what their vision is for becoming their own school. There's no checklist, oh, now you're a thinking school. It would be like me saying, oh, now you're a thinking person, right? Wouldn't that be insulting? It would not be congruent with the mission. So there isn't any stamp of approval, you're now a thinking school. So how do we engage schools in collaborative and rich action research that then is shared all over the globe? So what we've done, this is some of the results from the first 60 schools that have been accredited. And this is reporting out. This is not pre-post control group, you know, the gold standard. Self-esteem increased, independent learning increased, raised achievement. I always like to say that we didn't hurt these schools. That their achievement, the achievement went up in all the schools. We can't take credit for that, and I wouldn't. It's more a matter of they really focused on thinking and got all these other things, and their attainment on standardized tests all went up. Deeper understanding was reported, improved questioning, and skills for lifelong learning. We publish research, so there's a book on that called Pathways to Thinking, just so you know that that's there. And you can look at this slide at another time, it's too much, but we have set up an accreditation process with criteria that the school can use, whether or not they go through a formal process of accreditation. It's for them to use to think about, so for example, how student-centered is the development of their thinking? Is there student fluency with the models? And how are they communicating their learning in different modalities? And so we have these 5 areas with criteria and rubrics that support schools in becoming reflective schools, what I would consider to be thinking schools. If you would just take a moment, and I know we just have a moment, turn to your partner, look back to your original circle map. Oh, don't look there. Just have a talk. What's something that you pulled out of this presentation? Because I put out a lot. What's something that you pulled out? So we got to go. Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you. So I'm here for a little bit, and then I'm out in one of those booths out there sitting in a chair. So.